Right, thanks very much. June 2013, a memorable month for me personally, and actually a memorable month for over 2,000 people who are the Wesley staff. I received a large number of phone calls, texts, emails from a large number of people in the industry, some of whom are here today. The key message that a lot of them sent to me was, "There by the grace of God go I." So what I wanted to do today was not so much talk about, yes, we will talk about Legionella because it was a Legionella issue, but this is actually genuine crisis management, and there are a number of lessons that we learnt out of this, which hopefully in the spirit of coming to a conference, there are a handful of things you can take away for you. Not that I want you to take away the idea of going through a Legionella crisis, but managing in a crisis was an interesting exercise, and hopefully you can hear some of the things that we learnt out of this. Okay, so the Wesley Hospital, by way of background, it is one of the largest private hospitals in this country. It has, and it's pertinent to raise here, like any hospital, it grows as the years go on, and the original hospital, which is this crucifix form here, was built in 1970, opened in 1977, and since then there have been major extensions, and you'll hear during this presentation reference to the Morelands wing, which was this wing here of about 150 beds, which was opened about year 2000. This is the east wing here, which is the new wing that was opened in 2009. Interestingly, here are the medical centres down this side here, this building and this building. They, interestingly, are served by a completely separate water pipes from outside of the main hospital, which is interesting when you hear some of the issues we're about to go through. We also have a medical centre on the top of our car park. Now, Wesley's not immune to crises. This wasn't the first one that we had. Here is a photograph of Wesley in January 2011. I suspect where I'm standing today, I would have been standing in water. This was a momentous month for Brisbane and certainly momentous for Wesley. What it doesn't show, this is Coronation Drive, this is the Brisbane Rivers down here. This is Coronation Drive, which is one of the main access routes to the western suburbs. And what it doesn't show is that over here in this far corner, it was also water, so the hospital was actually an island. And to give you an idea of the depth of it, there is an railway bridge undercrossing, which is about 12 feet high. We were cut off for 70 hours at that time. Nobody in or out of the hospital, except over the railway bridge by foot here. And it was a great team building exercise for the 2,000 staff at the time, and for the we didn't have all that many patients in at the time because it was second week of January, but there were about, by memory, 260 patients in, and we looked after them for the staff that were isolated in the hospital, and looked after them very successfully. So, just by way of overview, this is the sort of scale of Wesley. Interestingly, for your interest, those medical centres I talked about, we have about 300 specialists who have their rooms, most of whom they own in strata titles, and they produce about 80% of the volume of our business. But it is a reasonable scale facility. These are the sort of daily volumes that we treat, and these are the sort of annual numbers, and probably most importantly is the range of services which became particularly pertinent during this crisis that we had. It does have one of the most comprehensive range of cancer services, particularly for everything from radiotherapy bunkers. We've got 3 of those, through bone marrow transplantation, complex oncology, and palliative care. As we were to find out from the early stage of this crisis, a number of the services that we operate here, which include the likes of bone marrow and renal dialysis and others, the rest of the public and private hospital system in this state could not actually cope with. So we actually could not evacuate this hospital even if we wanted to. So what actually happened? Well, by a quirk of fate, and often these sort of things happen at the worst times, by a quirk of fate, our general manager, Anne Maguire, was being treated for lymphoma at this time. So she was off sick. Lewis, who's going to speak in a minute, was actually recovering from emergency surgery not all that far earlier than this. And so I referred to myself as the acting general manager. I happened to be there when all this happened, and I'm the little bunny who was in the headlights. In the week leading up to the first patient's death, which is on the 2nd of June, in the week leading up to that, the treating physician, God bless his socks, did a series of tests which included a test of Legionella. And Legionella tests take some time to come back, as does tests for Legionella pneumophila in water. They actually take 5 days. So we knew that there wasn't this patient who had complex cancers. We knew that he'd been in the hospital for some time. We also knew that we had clean air conditioning units because of the regulatory requirements that we have in this state. And we, of course, were clear of Legionella in those. As a result of that, and because the treating physician had trained extensively in the UK, he also tested for Legionella in the water. You will notice that the test result came back for Legionella in the water 3 days later, which was a day after we actually got the positive Legionella test for the patient who had deceased. On the same day, in fact, the evening that we received the positive Legionella result in the water, we had a confirmed second case of Legionella pneumophila. Now, interestingly, the first patient was in the new block, East Wing, and the second patient was in the old block from 1977, particularly pertinent as we went on in this crisis. So, what did we do? Well, we ended up deciding to close the hospital. And the reason I decided, and it was me who decided to close the hospital, was that given that we had 2 patients diagnosed within a week, both of whom had been in the hospital for some time, then from my perspective it was pretty clear that we had a problem somewhere in the hospital, and it was somewhere in the water system, and we didn't know where. Interestingly, in the retrospectoscope, which we've used a lot through this process, we did have business interruption insurance, and I might add we ended up getting about $7.7 million back from the insurers. The insurers initially disputed the claim and maintained that the decision to close the hospital wasn't mine, who was authorised to close the hospital. And interestingly, in this state, as it turned out, the Chief Health Officer is in fact not authorised to close a private hospital. I thought that they were. But in any event, as I pointed out to the insurers, did you really want me to keep the hospital open and then have a 3rd or a 4th or a 5th case? Because then there'd be another insurance claim. So they backed down after that, and we subsequently did end up with a successful claim. So we closed the hospital of new admissions, and as you can see from those timeframes, it's actually a month until we actually opened the full hospital, and we opened it in stages, which helped us getting back on our feet. So what did we have in on the day, the fateful day, the 5th of June 2013? Well, we had these volumes of patients, and I've pointed out some of them, such as the bone marrow transplants, where we could not transfer them if we wanted to. Dialysis in this volume was not capable to be managed elsewhere, so we had to work out how to treat them as well. And we also had a number of patients in maternity. We actually had quite a large number of very complex medical oncology patients. So what is Legionella? Well, what is Legionella pneumophila, the particular condition which can cause death? Well, that's what it is, and it can be prevalent in both air conditioning and in warm water systems, not hot water systems, but warm water. It lives, and believe me, I know more as a general manager, CEO, about Legionella in water than any other one of you in this auditorium, I can guarantee you. It can't live above 50 degrees. And so whilst all hospitals, well, the majority of hospitals have hot water tanks and they have cold water, and they are mixed at the tap through what are called thermomixing valves. It's where the water is mixed at the valves that causes the problem with Legionella. In our instance, it can live quite comfortably at around 20 degrees, and the water temperature in Queensland is pretty consistently at that sort of level. So in fact, we had the view right from the start that where this was coming from was outside the hospital, which as it turns out was right. Who is particularly at risk? Well, for Wesley, we have a large volume of patients who are particularly at risk, which is a little more unusual than most private hospitals with the level of complexity of immunocompromised patients. At any one time at Wesley, we would have somewhere between 150 and 200 patients who are suffering some form of cancer treatment, and a number of those are particularly ill from a medical oncology perspective. So what were our immediate problems, our immediate challenges? Well, we had over 100 particularly sick patients. We worked out pretty smartly in talking with the Chief Health Officer and the Minister that in fact they couldn't cope with some of the patients, so we couldn't close the hospital. We had to work out how to cleanse the water system with patients still in beds, which became an interesting exercise. And I put it to you all who run hospitals, if you go back to your hospital and ask your engineers to provide you with an up-to-date map of your plumbing, the chances are you won't have it. We certainly didn't have it. And we had to work out exactly where all the pipes went and what interconnected with where. And that was a fairly extensive exercise, given we had over 31 kilometres of pipe, as I can now tell you. So what did we have to decide up front? Well, we decided right from the start, which I would never go back on. I think it was a good decision that we would deal directly with the media. We'd deal with them up front, we'd deal with them in an open and honest way with one spokesperson, which was little old me. Now, I'm sure most of you have had media training, so have I. No amount of media training can get you used to having to go through what I went through. I don't care how good you are. This was probably my greatest personal challenge. The best decision we made, without any doubt, was the agreement from day one that we would have daily staff meetings, and I meant every day. And we have a large auditorium which holds quite a few hundred people, and we had meetings open to all staff every day. As it turned out, I would end up timing them to be either immediately before or after press conferences that I held, and they were being held on those days. And the fact that we were open and honest with our staff came back to help us enormously as we went through this crisis. We also had daily communications with our doctors. Lewis was particularly strong on that personally. I obviously was there with a number of them. And of course, keeping the staff informed exactly where we were at and what we were doing, they also, of course, communicated back with the docs. Of course, as you'd imagine, it was hurting their business as well as ours. We kept up very regular communications with our inpatients and their families. We decided right up front we needed to obviously contact our pending admissions, and we also made it clear who was going to end up being the decision-making team, because clearly there were going to be a number of decisions we're going to have to make fairly urgently. Now, some of you might be wondering why on earth are we not aware of this, because I can tell you that different states in this country, in the classic federal model, have different protocols and regulations around Legionella. In this state, in Queensland, Legionella in warm water was simply not on the radar. We, in this state, up until June 2013, had no requirements, public or private, to test water in warm water systems for Legionella. Yes, for air conditioning, no for warm water systems. And that's interesting when you start looking at the differences between states, because they are markedly different. So we had no sense that this was going to be a problem. We established an incident management team, which was probably in retrospect a bit too large. We commenced our communication to our staff and our patients and our docs immediately that evening. We appointed external media advisors, which was another great decision that we did, which included advisors on social media, which I'll come to a little shortly, which again was a great decision. We obviously had to supply bottled water to everybody. We had to stop showering all our patients. We spoke to the Chief Health Officer before we closed it. That's when she said, well, we can't take your patients. And of course we had to set up a call centre, not only to contact our previous 1,400 patients, who are the numbers we'd treated in the period for that a Legionella infection can breed, but also we also had to contact the patients who were coming in, plus all those who were ringing in wanting to know what was going on. Here's a photo in the early stages of our incident team, and for your interest, that includes our specialist water advisors. It included our infection control people, included our senior nurses, our senior doctors. The fellow right at the front here is a media advisor, and a number of senior nursing staff, because the staff ended up supporting us enormously in actually cleansing the water. On day 2, we held our first press conference. It was one of 8 that I ended up having to have. We started our media releases, and it was the second day that we started our general staff meetings. We had to work out how to fix the problem. Pretty fundamental, really. So we established an external expert review board, which comprised representatives from both public and private sector. Obviously people who understood water and infection control, but we actually needed someone to fix the problem, and this is actually quite hard to find. I can't begin to tell you how many quacks there are out there telling you how you can treat your water. We ended up appointing an organisation which actually we found on day 3, and they actually arrived on day 5 to work out how to actually go about getting the Legionella out of our water pipes. The press conferences, this was one of the in fact I think this might have been the first one. It started fairly small, and every one I went to, they seemed to get larger. Or was it my perception? I won't go into the technical details, but for your interest, you can put hot water through pipes that you know have got Legionella, or you think have got Legionella in them, like shower heads and faucets. And hot water will scald it and will fix the problem for about 2 days. But the inherent underlying problem of Legionella pneumophila in water is actually in the biofilm that sits inside water pipes, and you need to clean the biofilm out in order to get the Legionella out. And that requires a very significant disinfection process of putting in very high levels of alkalinity, followed by very heavy levels of chlorination, and flushing your water pipes. You'd be amazed how much dirty, crappy black water comes out when you do that. And we had to do that while we had, the minimum we had was 116 patients in the hospital, and of course the water was toxic. So we had to do that in stages through the various buildings. And those are the stages that you can see on the screen. Okay, what were the main challenges? Well, the main challenges from my perspective were maintaining an air of composure, I suppose. This went on for a month, and there were a number of separate crises that went on during that month. You know, everybody, we were waiting for the 3rd, 4th and 5th, which thankfully never arrived, cases. We had a number of people who thought they had Legionella who'd been in our hospital, and we had to get them assessed fairly smartly, and they didn't. We had to deal, of course, with patients, their families, and also, as Lewis will talk shortly, on dealing with the families of the patients who were infected. We had at all times the need to demonstrate that we actually knew what we were doing and that we were in control. That was at times quite challenging. We obviously had to maintain confidence of the staff, and it became harder over the period of time this occurred because there was burnout. There was clearly burnout amongst our staff, our senior staff, and maintaining the continuum was quite difficult. Decision making to fix the problem, you think about it, ladies and gentlemen, you had to work out when you were putting high alkaline and high chlorine water through things like pipes that go to dialysis machines, or pipes that go to CSSD machines, or pipes that go to various complex bits of equipment which are scattered through this hospital. We had to try and work out what would and what wouldn't work. What did we have to move? What could we shut off? And then, of course, we had to move patients around while we were doing all this. Dealing with the media, which I'll come to in a sec, was actually extraordinarily challenging. They can be quite difficult. Yeah, I'm pleased you didn't cover that one. But of course, they're always into the sensational side of things, and trying to put forward the facts is what's always one of the biggest challenges here. So what were some of the other issues we had to deal with? Well, one of the first things that came through my mind was, well, hang on a minute, if it's at Wesley, is it in the other hospitals in our group? I bet you bottom dollar it's across Queensland. Just on the other UCH hospitals, we obviously started the testing regime at our other facilities. Whilst we didn't find Legionella outbreaks in the water at the time, we have subsequently. We're building a new hospital at Hervey Bay, and one of the ways that Legionella can breed in your water pipes is if you have what are referred to as dead legs, which are pipes that go nowhere and are a dead end, and therefore infection can breed, diseases can breed in that dead end water. We had a large number of them. I'll put it to you that from the facilities that you're at, I can guarantee you'll have dead legs. You only need to relocate a hand basin from part way down a water pipe to somewhere else and close that off and don't use the end, and you'll have a dead leg. We had to map all our pipes, which took us some weeks, and we had a large number of them. In our new facility at Hervey Bay, they had actually designed dead legs into it. Why? Because it's designed for future expansion, so naturally there were pipes that went nowhere at the end, and we had to actually change the design of the pipes, which is an issue I took to the Minister, that he's going to need to make some regulatory change to stop that from happening into the future, because you can. We had to work out what was going on in the rest of the industry in this space, because it is different in different states. And as we found out, and as Lewis was so competent on here, finding out examples in other parts of the world where they had Legionella in the water and major disasters that came from that, which were far more deaths than we experienced. And we learned a lot about how they managed it. And we knew, and I knew, and Lewis knew, and the whole team knew that we weren't alone here. And yet the examples overseas that we looked at, one of the real challenges for hospitals that have had this problem in a very high profile way is that it was never made public whether in fact Legionella was actually in the water in the rest of the city, such as Edinburgh. So I spoke to the Chief Health Officer. I said, you better start testing your water in your other hospitals, because my betting is that it's there. And she indicated that that's what she would do, but she would not make the results public. I said, well, I think that's grossly unfair, because that'll mean that people will think it's just at Wesley and nowhere else. I spoke to the Minister that evening on his mobile, and he agreed with me, and the next day they did agree to release the results. Suffice to say, the rest is history. I think there were over 100 hospitals in this state that have shown positive Legionella in their water. How they've dealt with it since then varies enormously from hospital to hospital. So we had significant impact on our staff. Now, the fact that we dealt with them up front and we were open and transparent, we actually had to stand them down, because as you can imagine, there weren't many patients left on the hospital. We continued to pay them. and a large number of them would come back each day to hear the briefings. Hundreds of them, literally hundreds of them, put their hands up to help us with doing water sampling and testing, which we had to train them on, and assisting us with our cleaning regime, because obviously you have to test the water and then the crap water that comes out, you've got to clean it. We actually had no idea how long all this was going to take. Their commitment and their resoluteness was something that kept us all going. And in fact, it's ironic in many respects that the morale of this hospital took a huge turn upwards as a result of this crisis, not downwards, as evidenced from various ways that we tested it down the track. We also had to deal with unions. For those of you who might remember, there was some extraneous suggestions of there being linkages to previous cases of Legionella at the hospital, and the acting head of the Queensland Nurses Union decided to make an issue of it and went public on a number of occasions, calling me a liar. He actually used those words, and causing a lot of media interest. I found it very uplifting that the staff of the hospital, they actually wanted to lynch him. They demanded a meeting with him. A large number of nursing staff at the hospital resigned from the union, and when he came to a meeting on a particular day, whilst I wasn't there, of course at the meeting I heard from a number of nurses who said that it was not a pleasant meeting for him and he left with his tail between his legs. And I think that's an example of engaging with your staff in a proactive and positive way. And we didn't hear much from the unions after that. We obviously had a lot of internal stakeholders that we had to keep fully briefed. Maintaining the incident management team for 4 weeks was a challenge. We had to bring people in to back up some so that they could have time out, because when this happens you live and breathe it 24 hours a day. We had a large number of external stakeholders. The public health people, there were no policies and procedures and protocols in place, zero in this state, and it really was policy on the run, which was challenging for us in the context of trying to resolve a crisis whilst the bureaucrats were trying to work out what to do. We had to deal with politicians. We had to deal with the media, and of course, as I've said, making sure that the other hospital results were released. Obviously, we had to deal with health funds, the GP referring community. There were a large number of people that we had to deal with. So we had this essentially a very prolonged crisis, and I'll actually get Lewis to talk on the issue of our dealing with our patients and their families, because that was also a very important piece for us to cope with. Fixing the problem was actually more difficult than you thought. This toxic water was challenging to actually make sure that we didn't actually hurt anybody in this process. Occupational health and safety became paramount for us. Interestingly, the cost of compliance for us now, because as you'd imagine, I could not cope with another Legionella outbreak at Wesley for obvious reasons from reputation. So we do exhaustive testing now on a monthly basis. And so far since we opened the hospital has spent somewhere north of $1 million on its ongoing water treatment and testing program. And that is a very difficult issue to try and sustain. And we're actually working now on ways we can redo parts of the hospital from an engineering perspective to try and cope with a reduction in those costs. The media was one of the more difficult things for us. As you can see here, we had 31 media releases with 8 formal press conferences. There was enormous media interest, and we used various forms of communication. And if there were some lessons out of this which were really positive, this is definitely into one of them. We knew that, and I'd read, and our social media advisors had told us that if you stuff up the social media, that has the potential to come back and bite you real quick, like within half an hour. So we set up a Facebook page which because we found a lot of people were going through Facebook to ask us questions. We set up a Facebook page, and we had a policy whereby we would aim to respond to questions or comments on Facebook within 15 minutes of them posting it. And at one point we had quite a panel of people doing that. And they would obviously be seeking advice as to how to respond from a number of us. The reality was that our Facebook page became our best PR. And became our best PR because those who posted incorrect statements, and there were a stack of them, were given the facts for everybody to see who looked at Facebook. For those who asked generic questions, they were given prompt answers for all to see. And for those who asked specific questions for them, we responded just for them, but their response back, which was always a very positive response, we made public for all to see, to demonstrate our attempt to be as proactive as possible. And we actually linked our Facebook page to our web page, and another great piece of work by our advisors, because it became a very positive PR piece for us. The website we found was used a lot by people who are older, who aren't on Facebook and Twitter. And we had a dedicated Legionella update page, and as you can see, we had a very large number of hits. We kept updating that, and sometimes we'd update it 4 or 5 times a day. We also had a Twitter account, which we again linked it into our Facebook page, and we found that to be another useful way of ensuring we're getting up-to-date messages out there into the community. This received extraordinary media coverage. I was at a post a couple of months after all this happened. I was at a function and met a colleague of mine who said he was sitting in a cafe in Paris reading a Parisian newspaper, and it was in the Parisian newspaper. We had coverage basically around the world, and because it is fairly unusual for this sort of thing to occur. So how we dealt with the media was quite critical. So, using the social and online media gave us the ability to get the truly accurate information out there immediately. We were able to directly allay patient, staff and community concerns, and in fact there were a number of instances where patients themselves would be on Facebook, and there were about 5 occasions where I personally went up and spoke to those patients, and they ended up putting it back on Facebook saying, "You never to go what, ladies and gentlemen, the boss has just come to see me and it's great that I'm being heard." Here are some of the examples. This happened during State of Origin. Now it's pretty impressive, isn't it, that the Courier Mail got us on page 1 at the time of State of Origin. Bloody extraordinary, really, isn't it? That's right, New South Wales won the first match, that's right. Yes, the 5th of June, the day this actually heard, was the first of the 3 State of Origin matches. Here are a couple of other examples of some of the international media that we had. So I'm going to hand over to Lewis, who's going to briefly talk to you about some of the medical impacts of this case.
In fullness of time, I just want to say it was very hard and we did very well. Thank you. Richard is right about the international interest. My family is mainly Spanish. They all saw it in Spain and they gave me lots of feedback, but being Spanish, their main concern was whether my tie matched my shirt at any meeting and photos were taken. They've always got their priorities right. As Richard has alluded to, we'd had a lot of sick patients in the hospital, not as many as we would normally have by the time we obviously closed to admissions, but obviously some very sick people, otherwise they wouldn't still be in hospital. And one of the, you always question a lot of decisions you make in crises, and later on when you're reflecting on them, particularly late at night or early hours of the morning when you can't sleep, you think whether you made the right calls. And one of the things that occurred to me as the DMS is whether or not we should test all the patients who are in hospital at a time. And this was brought up to me by patients, by their doctors, by the GPs, and by staff. And the testing for Legionella is not that complicated to do, and she saw there's a time frame for it to be turned around. But I consulted the specialists at my hospital, infectious diseases specialists, about the reason to or not to test. I then went outside externally and did that for my own good governance. And then I thought to myself, well, Mum was a patient and she only just got home. Should I test her if she's not sick? And I'd just been discharged. Would I test myself? And the test for me was I would either have a Legionella test or not. If I was going to have one and I wasn't sick, that meant every single patient who'd been at the hospital, all 1,800, would have to have one. Or otherwise I couldn't legitimately look at anybody in the eye and say whether or not the test was required. And that was probably, for me, one of the more critical decisions to make early on, and to advise the general manager, who was at that time, as you know, Richard. We had, apart from the inpatients that at the time in the hospital, a real issue that Wesley being a large hospital for Brisbane and for indeed Queensland, we are also the community hospital for the western suburbs. So when the hospital is closed, it means that patients who would normally come to the Wesley as their first choice hospital for either new problems or, very importantly, for ongoing medical care, particularly the cancer patients, their care was going to be compromised if they could not come to the hospital. So we had to have plans in place for specialties and down to individual patients to look after them in this time period where they were at risk of not being able to come back, where their history sometimes, as you would have in your hospitals, the 5 volumes of cancer care, etc. And in particular, patients who had multiple medical problems and multiple specialties, specialists looking after them. The general practice community gave us great support, but in another way caused us some heartache, in that for 2 reasons. First of all, access for the hospital for their own patients, understanding our situation but needing to get help and care and advice. And secondly, because of the media attention onto Legionella, they started testing for it. And the knowledge of Legionella, particularly the interpretation of results in general practice, and I say as a GP, I'm not, at that stage, I would have been in the same position as them, the interpretation is quite complex, and as a result, it meant that we fielded many calls from general practice asking us what the result they had meant for patients of their own, for patients who'd been at the hospital, for families who'd visited the hospital, and for people who actually just came to the hospital after to use the gym for cardiac rehab. And in each and every case, either myself, my deputy Chris Beck, or one of the infectious diseases specialists went through the results and advised the doctors what those results meant. On my next slide, I'll talk about the clinical services impact, but as a training hospital, as many private hospitals now are, if you're offline with patients for a significant period of time, there is an inevitable impact on training for clinical staff and students. The acute admissions were put on hold and they weren't able to be admitted when the hospital was closed, and that included patients who were going to be readmitted, either knowingly readmitted for ongoing care, or the best example is cancer patients who had febrile neutropenia, where their clinical plan was to present to the hospital in the case of having a temperature. And that included some people very close to our heart who therefore had to be found alternative accommodation in other hospitals. And so it's appropriate for us to acknowledge St Andrew's War Memorial Hospital, our sister hospital at Spring Hill, who without we could not have managed to manage the patients we had, both due to have surgery and other care, and also took patients of ours which would normally at Wesley and would come back. We did have assistance from other private hospitals, but St Andrew's carried the large load for us. The interruption of core business, and that's for core business for private, is a lot of the elective surgery. Apart from the financial impact, there's obviously a reputational impact for a period of time that we could have suffered if that wasn't managed well. Our emergency department sees 23,000 people a year, admitting a third of those, and closing the emergency department to ambulance care is one thing, and that obviously did occur, but walk-ins occurred all the time. So we had a functioning emergency department, but to actually undertake the remediation work that Richard alluded to required us to move the emergency department and relocate it into a clinical ward so that we could actually go through and clean the pipes in the emergency department, a very complex task that we had. The moving of patients internally was probably the greatest challenge when it came to the ongoing clinical services, and we had to individualise decisions for patients, particularly those in the bone marrow transplant unit, where we balanced the risk of them being in one environment with regards to cleaning and toxic chemical exposure to another environment which on the face of water cleaning was actually safer, but didn't have the laminar flow or negative pressure rooms you require for some cancer patients. So we individualised those plans and down to impact how many hours they would be in one space versus another. And with regards to dialysis, it was simply not able to be given to the public or any private facility to take on our patients, and so those patients were managed by having a completely new water line brought into the hospital and into the dialysis unit so that those patients could continue with their care. It's very easy to lose in such a crisis over a month the impact on the individual patients and their families that was presented at the very beginning. The patient who passed away, the second case, and their families. And Uniting Care Health, through our church, are committed to the open disclosure framework as part of Standard 1 of the National Commission standards, and open disclosure is fundamental to our practice, particularly in clinical practice, and so we undertook that process with the families. That is difficult to do. They don't care about everything else you're dealing with. They're not interested in about the drama you're having with the unions or the media. They're not interested about how well you're cleaning the pipes today because it's already too late for their family. And we had ongoing discussions and meetings with them. I've met them personally, the families face-to-face on a number of occasions, and phone call discussions, including up to only a couple of weeks ago, and assisting in many different ways. There is clearly some medical legal implications that the risk managers and others in this audience would be aware of in such a circumstance, and of course we had to undertake a very thorough incident investigation and management with regards to the actual incident, including everything down to how we were notified, who knew what when, how we could improve the systems of notification and escalation of an incident. From a pure clinical perspective, if it's of interest to anyone here, the diagnosis, Richard mentioned the difficulties in timeline. We had that an ongoing issue with regards to checking patients. You can imagine the fingernail biting that goes on in this period of time where you're waiting for outstanding results on people who've got a temperature and a bit of a cough, and you've got the press asking you, have they got Legionella, or people who think they have. And I mentioned the confusion about some of the results being interpreted incorrectly by the community, including community doctors. But the last thing I'd mention is there are hospitals who announced that they had Legionella testing positive, but called it non-pathogenic. So just to let you know, there is no such thing as non-pathogenic Legionella. It's just the Legionella I want to have that I don't want to tell anybody else about, and use another. And that does not help when you're trying to deal with patients with real problems. As a subsequent to this, we have had to look at how the clinical guidelines at the Wesley with respect to the investigation of people with pneumonia in hospital and people who present to the hospital with pneumonia, otherwise known as community-acquired pneumonia. And we've undergone a retrospective audit of patients with pneumonia at our hospital who presented or to the hospital or suffered from pneumonia whilst an inpatient, and also developed the guidelines for the investigation of that in an ongoing fashion. And we have an ongoing audit process in place to see if compliance with the investigation for pneumonia and for the treatment. So, in summary from the major lessons that we had, the decision about closing evacuating hospital is extraordinarily difficult, and the decision that Richard made closing the hospital clearly for the clinical services was an extremely important one to have done at that time. We did note, and when I came back to the hospital about 3 or 4 days after the event started from sick leave, it certainly was a lot of people involved, and I think in retrospect we would probably have a few less people in the actual critical incident management team who are making the big decisions. We all train for emergency response and crisis management. In a month it takes a lot out of people, and fatigue management was a real issue with regards to making decisions at any time of the day and night over every day of the week. And just like in clinical practice, we noticed that the handover between team members and the incident management team was vital. If you've got what I call Team B coming in on the weekend to continue the plan that you've put in place during the week, they needed to be completely abreast of everything that was occurring in the hospital, from cleaning water all the way to clinical care, to be able to continue to manage the crisis. Something that people who are familiar with environmental crisis would know that if it goes on for a period of time, you just can't have one group. And Richard's going to finish off.
Thanks, Lewis. I know we're over time, so I just want to close on showing you these slides. We really didn't get a sense in advance of what the hospital was going to do in terms of the recognition by the community and the doctors. And these slides sort of put it all together, really. This is when we opened. We opened it in 3 stages, as you saw in one of the early slides. And so essentially within 2 weeks of opening, we were almost back to normal operating. And I think that's a great reflection on the reputation of the Wesley Hospital. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, very much.